The glass doors of Orion Dynamics slammed open and a man walked out carrying a cardboard box that held the remains of his career. His hands trembled but his face stayed calm because in that moment Adrian Hale understood something terrifying. The world had already decided he was guilty. Inside the building the whispers were louder than the office alarms that morning. Harassment investigation termination. Security escort people stared through the tall lobby windows as Adrian stepped into the rain. The cardboard box in his arms held a few notebooks, a mug that said "World's Okayest Engineer," and the small metal badge that had once granted him access to one of the most prestigious tech companies in the city. Behind those windows on the top floor stood CEO Eleanor Cross, the woman who had just signed the document that destroyed him. But what none of them knew was that the truth had already begun moving like a slow earthquake beneath their feet, and when it surfaced months later it would ruin them all. Adrian Hale had never been the loudest engineer at Orion Dynamics, but he had been the smartest, the kind of quiet problem solver every company secretly depended on. He worked late without complaining, fixed systems no one else could understand, and spent weekends refining designs that would save the company millions. People trusted him because Adrian was the kind of man who remembered everyone's coffee order and stayed behind to help interns debug code long after his own work was finished, which made the accusation feel impossible. 3 weeks earlier Adrian had been called into human resources where two executives sat beside a nervous assistant with a laptop open. They spoke carefully using corporate language that sounded polite but carried the weight of a verdict. A complaint had been filed. A female colleague claimed Adrian had behaved inappropriately during a late-night development session. There were messages, screenshots, and a witness statement. Adrian stared at them as if they had just spoken another language because he knew exactly which night they meant, and he knew something was very wrong. That night had been the most important night of his career. Adrian and a small engineering team had been finishing the prototype for a groundbreaking AI-powered medical system called Helios, a platform that could predict cardiac failure hours before it happened. Hospitals across the country were already waiting for it. Investors were watching closely, and the CEO herself had visited the lab several times that week. Eleanor Cross, she was known in the tech world as ruthless, brilliant, and unstoppable. At only 42, she had turned Orion Dynamics into a billion-dollar empire through fearless decisions and aggressive acquisitions. Employees admired her from a distance, but they also feared her because Eleanor Cross did not tolerate weakness. That night she had come into the lab around midnight. The engineers were exhausted, pizza boxes stacked beside servers humming with heat, and Adrian had been sitting at his workstation debugging a catastrophic error in the prediction algorithm. When Eleanor walked in, the entire room straightened instantly. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She walked directly to Adrian's screen and asked one question: "Why isn't Helios ready yet?" Adrian explained the flaw calmly. The predictive model required more training data, otherwise the system could misdiagnose patients and hospitals could face serious risk. Eleanor listened silently, her sharp eyes never leaving the code scrolling across his monitor. Then she said something that made Adrian's stomach tighten. "Launch it anyway." Adrian shook his head gently. He explained that releasing an unstable medical AI could cost lives. The room went silent because no one disagreed with him, but no one wanted to challenge the CEO either. Eleanor's voice dropped colder. "Investors expect the announcement next week." Adrian replied quietly, "Patients deserve something that works." It was the first time anyone in that room had seen Eleanor Cross lose her composure. She leaned closer and whispered something only Adrian heard. "You work for this company, not the other way around." Adrian didn't answer. He simply turned back to the code and continued fixing the system. That moment lasted only seconds, but it planted a seed of something dangerous. Pride wounded, authority challenged, power questioned. 3 days later the complaint was filed. The accusation came from Melissa Grant, a junior developer who worked on Adrian's team. According to her statement, Adrian had made inappropriate remarks during their late-night session, then tried to touch her shoulder when they were alone. The screenshots she submitted appeared to show awkward messages sent from Adrian's account. Human resources moved quickly. The company had a strict zero-tolerance policy, and the CEO personally oversaw the investigation. Adrian tried to explain he had never sent those messages. He had barely spoken to Melissa beyond technical discussions, and security cameras would prove they were never alone. But strangely, the camera footage from that part of the lab was suddenly missing due to a system error. Within 48 hours Adrian Hale was fired. The story spread quickly through the company. Some people doubted it quietly, but no one dared defend him publicly because when the CEO supports a decision the company follows. Melissa received sympathy and a transfer to another department. Eleanor Cross moved forward with the Helios launch, and Adrian disappeared. The months that followed were harder than anything Adrian had imagined. Job interviews ended the moment companies searched his name. Online industry forums discussed the scandal as a cautionary tale. Friends stopped calling. Even his landlord looked at him differently. Adrian spent weeks in a small apartment surrounded by unfinished prototypes, wondering how truth could vanish so easily, but one thing kept bothering him: those messages. They looked like his account, yet he had never written them, and engineers know something important: systems always leave traces. So Adrian started investigating. He accessed an old backup server where development logs were stored automatically, hidden deep within the system. He discovered something unusual on the night of the alleged messages. His login had been accessed from another workstation, a workstation assigned not to him but to the executive floor. The deeper Adrian dug, the stranger it became. File timestamps had been modified, security logs erased, and the camera system in the lab had been manually disabled for exactly 12 minutes. That kind of access required executive clearance. Adrian stared at the data for hours, feeling something heavy settle in his chest, because there was only one person in the building with both motive and authority to do that: Eleanor Cross. Meanwhile, the Helios launch went exactly as she planned. Media praised Orion Dynamics as pioneers. Stock prices surged. Hospitals rushed to sign contracts. Eleanor appeared on magazine covers, smiling beside headlines that called her the visionary saving modern medicine. But beneath that success, the system Adrian warned about was quietly failing. Hospitals began reporting strange prediction errors. Patients flagged as critical were perfectly healthy, while real emergencies slipped through the cracks. Engineers scrambled to patch the system, but the deeper flaw remained: the model had never been fully trained exactly as Adrian predicted. One evening, 6 months after Adrian was fired, something unexpected happened. A young cybersecurity analyst named Daniel Cho was reviewing internal logs. During a routine audit, he noticed irregular access records connected to the night of Adrian's termination. Curious, Daniel traced the activity back through archived security layers. The trail led somewhere shocking: the CEO's personal authorization key. At first, Daniel assumed it was a mistake, but the more he analyzed the logs, the clearer the pattern became. Someone with executive access had altered messages, tampered with cameras, and erased evidence, and every trace pointed upward. Daniel hesitated for days. Reporting something like that could destroy his career, but engineers value truth almost as much as code, so he contacted Adrian anonymously. The email arrived late at night. Adrian read it twice, then a third time. Attached were log files proving someone had used administrative privileges to fabricate the evidence against him. Daniel didn't accuse anyone directly, but the implication was obvious. Together they began assembling the full timeline. What they discovered was devastating. After Adrian refused to launch Helios early, Eleanor Cross had made a decision: she needed him removed quickly before he could delay the project. But firing the lead engineer without reason would raise questions, so a scandal was manufactured. Melissa Grant had been promised a promotion and financial compensation to file the complaint. Corporate security disabled cameras, IT staff altered system logs under executive orders, and Adrian Hale became the perfect scapegoat. But conspiracies rarely stay buried forever, because the Helios failures were growing impossible to ignore. Hospitals demanded explanations. Regulators launched inquiries, and Daniel's evidence finally reached the board of directors. The emergency board meeting lasted nearly 8 hours. Executives argued, voices shaking with disbelief. When the final report was displayed on the conference screen, the room fell silent. Every altered log, every deleted camera frame, every falsified message traced back to Eleanor Cross's authorization. The truth shattered the empire she built. News broke the following morning: the CEO, who once dominated magazine covers, was now the center of a corporate scandal involving fraud, obstruction, and false accusations. Investors fled. The Helios system was pulled from hospitals. Government investigators stepped in, and the board removed Eleanor Cross from power immediately. But the consequences did not stop there. Melissa Grant confessed to participating in the scheme after facing legal pressure. Several executives resigned. Orion Dynamics lost billions in value, and the company that once celebrated innovation became a cautionary story about ambition without integrity. As for Adrian Hale, he returned quietly to the engineering world, not with anger but with something stronger: purpose. A group of independent researchers invited him to lead a new medical AI project built on transparency and ethics. This time the system would be tested, thoroughly reviewed, openly, and designed to protect patients rather than profits. Months later, Adrian stood in a small lab surrounded by a team that trusted him. The new system predicted cardiac emergencies with astonishing accuracy. Doctors called it one of the safest diagnostic tools ever created. During the first successful hospital trial, Adrian stepped outside for fresh air. The evening sky glowed orange above the city, and for the first time in a year he felt something peaceful. Justice had taken time, but truth had found its way back somewhere far away. Courtrooms and investigations continued, dealing with the wreckage of Orion Dynamics. Eleanor Cross, who once controlled a billion-dollar empire, now faced trials that could define the rest of her life. But Adrian rarely thought about her anymore, because the most important Lesson he learned was something simple: power can silence people for a while, lies can bury truth for months, but eventually every system, every secret, every decision leaves evidence behind, and when the truth finally surfaces, it does not just expose the guilty, it rebuilds the lives they tried to destroy.